Good morning, everyone. I'm John OLoughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And this morning, really delighted to have joining me Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche Organization. Harley is a gentleman of great experience and knowledge of recent history, and a person who has been particularly helpful to me as I've reached out to try to find answers as to my father's life and what really happened and what was really going on behind the scenes that could have contributed to his early death. And this exploration has just grown and grown and grown. And thanks to Harley, I've got to meet some really important and influential people, including Helga LaRouche herself and so many other great people at the Children's Institute, as well as to just broaden my knowledge of what other people know, what other people have been doing by reading their materials at LaRoucheClub.com. So, Harley Schlanger, I'm very, very grateful to you for all the help you've given me over the past year or two, and welcome to the show. But I'm just going to turn it over to you at this point, because what we're doing right now is continuing the McDuff 50th year celebration that we started on Sunday, June 6th. And so Harley has some remarks that I'm looking forward to hear. So I'll give you Harley Schlanger.
Well, thank you, John. And I offer apologies for not being able to be part of the event on Sunday, but that was out of both of our control. What I want to do is, first of all, thank you for the work that you did in putting together this wonderful report of your father's life. And it affords us all an opportunity to look back over 50 to even 75 years of American history to get a sense of what's changed in the country, the paradigm shift that went on starting after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, to the point that today we're in a real crisis where you have on the one side a war threat, which hopefully won't be made worse by President Biden's meeting with Vladimir Putin next week, but it could be made worse if he goes along with the talking points they're putting out there. We have a global financial crisis because of the neoliberal economic policies. And then we also have a cultural crisis, a moral crisis, a degeneration of our nation. And I think looking through the work you did on your father enabled me to reflect on what actually is behind that. And I want to just as a preface say that as a historian, I've been very much taken by the work done by William Shakespeare, who I consider one of the great historians of all time. And in particular, in looking at what you prepared on your father's life, that it has to be taken as a tragedy, not necessarily a personal tragedy, although there were tragic elements about it. But in the real scope of Greek tragedy, the idea is not the tragedy of the individual. We're so much influenced by the idea of the tragic hero or the super figure. But in fact, real history is not so much about the tragic hero, although you want to know how a person responded to tragic circumstances, but about the tragedy that befalls a whole society when it goes down the wrong path, when the majority of its people accept fake axioms. That is, their default mechanisms in their belief structure are controlled by something that's not real and not something that reflects the common good. And so going back to this period that you concentrate on quite a bit in your book, the World War II period, and your father's heroic service during that time, we can reflect on the fact that there were a great number of Americans who were called to service during World War II, and it was a war that had to be fought. Now, perhaps we could have avoided it had we understood what was going on for the previous half century from the adoption of British geopolitics, because ultimately the whole 20th century was shaped by British geopolitical dogma. The idea that you had to have an enemy, you had to have a division of the world, you had to prevent the British. Mackinder believed, and the whole British elite accepted this, that the greatest threat to the British Empire was that Eurasia, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Africa, the Southwest Asia, the Middle East could come together in great projects of rail connection, of economic development, and that would take away the power of the British Empire, which was a sea-based power. And everything they did in the last decades of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century was designed to prevent those kinds of alliances from taking place. For example, the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, the Berlin to Vladivostok Railroad, those threatened British control of trade because it was much quicker to move freight by rail than it was by sea. And so Mackinder's doctrine, and it built on Alfred Thayer Mahan and his idea of sea power in history, was based on the idea that you have to prevent these alliances from coming into being. And we see how after World War I, which should not have happened, there should not have been a war in Europe in World War I, had the leaders of the European countries been aware of how they were being manipulated by the British Crown. But once that happened, Versailles was used at the end of the war, the Versailles Treaty, to set the preconditions for the next war. And this was largely the work of the post-Versailles Treaty of the cartels, the trusts, the City of London and Wall Street corporations that worked together with corporations in Germany to build the conditions which brought Hitler to power. And that continued to function. You know this story of the General Motors and the Rockefeller Trust, the rubber trusts. These were corporate conglomerates, not so different from the corporate cartels that function today. And for them, they operated over and above nations, and they wished to subordinate national policy to their interests. And this is still the problem we have today. So reflecting on how this impacted your father's life and what he did and his whole generation brings us to the whole question of what was the tragedy. And one final prefatory comment on Shakespearean tragedy. If you think about what I'm talking about, take the case of Hamlet. Now, everyone sees Hamlet as the tragic figure, a bright, energetic man, maybe sometimes a little bit lethargic, but someone whose father was murdered by his uncle. His birthright to become king after his father's death was stolen from him, and he bungled around trying to figure out what to do and eventually ended up killing off himself and the leadership of his country. Now, Hamlet understood the tragedy was not just him. Remember, early in the play, he says there's something rotten in Denmark. It was Denmark. It was the oligarchy that ran the country, because everyone should have known that with the death of his father, he should have become king. And instead of asserting that and organizing around that principle, he allowed himself to be contained by the axioms of that court culture. Now, Shakespeare lets us know that the real tragedy existed outside of the court culture, because Fortinbras in Norway was planning to come in and conquer Denmark. His army is massing through the whole play. And in the end, as Hamlet is carted off the stage, his lifeless form is carried away. Who comes and takes over Denmark but Fortinbras? So the tragedy was the whole society. And Shakespeare's view of tragedy, which is especially clear in his plays on the Tudor family, the English King series, is that it's the society as a whole which is infected with bad ideas. And true leadership is challenging those bad ideas. Now, with that as a preface, look what happened after World War II. Your father, like many, many vets, including my father, came back from the war with a certain sense that these 3 or 4 years of their life, which were lost, had to mean something. And what would the meaning be? Well, much of that idea of meaning was shaped by Franklin Roosevelt in his leadership during the war. And much of it occurred behind the scenes. His meetings with Churchill, where he repeatedly told Churchill, Never again will American boys die to defend the British Empire. And Churchill, of course, had a different view, which is that the British Empire will continue after the war, even though I could make a good case if I had more time that the two world wars were the result of British intervention and manipulation and meddling. Just as the British played a leading role in Russiagate, bringing down Trump, and are playing a leading role today in manipulating Biden going into his meeting with Putin next week. That's where the tragedy lies. What did Roosevelt know, and people like John Kennedy know? And by implication, was your father figuring out about who were the powers that ran the country and who were they acting on behalf of, if not the American people? Now, I bring up the case of John Kennedy because it's clear that Kennedy shared Roosevelt's view that Americans should not die for the British Empire. And Kennedy's whole career in politics became a fight against empire. Very few people read his speeches when he was in the Senate in the late 50s, but they were filled with criticism of the British Empire, of the French Empire. He gave a beautiful speech about Algeria in which he said, we're competing against two empires. One, the Soviet Empire. He said, everyone knows that, but the other empire were the colonial empires that enslaved the people of Africa. Kennedy was very straightforward on that. He saw the same problem in Vietnam, although when he first came in, he was trapped by what had been set up after the death of Roosevelt. Now, what was set up after Roosevelt's death? The British came in and took over the president, Harry Truman, who was a rather small figure, very much frightened, not quite clear on what he was supposed to do. And he came under the influence of Churchill, the famous Fulton, Missouri Iron Curtain speech, where Churchill said, look, your mission is to defend freedom. And what's freedom? The British Empire. And Truman bought into it. The CIA, which was set up after the war, was largely dominated by two forces. The white shoe law firms of Wall Street that gave the Dulleses and others, and the influence of the British Empire, in particular, Sir William Stevenson, who was sent in to organize the OSS to turn it into the CIA as a junior partner of the British Empire. And these are the ones who shaped the policy after the war. Now, some of the names are familiar: the Rockefellers, the Harrimans, the Morgans, the Mellon interests. These are the people I mentioned earlier who set up the corporate cartels before World War I and after World War I, and at the end of World War II intended to have global domination. So the fact that from this grouping you had John Foster Dulles from these families and his brother Allen Dulles, one Secretary of State, the other head of the CIA, makes perfect sense. That was the takeover of US foreign policy. Eisenhower knew some of this, and this is what he was referring to when he talked about the military-industrial complex on his way out the door. But he knew it earlier. The famous incident that shows that Eisenhower knew what he was up against was his speech, not his speech, but his warning to the British during the Suez Crisis in 1956, when the British and the French and the Israelis invaded Egypt. And they asked the United States to join, and Eisenhower instead said, you get the hell out of there or we're going to come after you. And shortly after Eisenhower sent that message, the British and the French backed off and the war ended. John Kennedy had a very clear sense of this also. And I just want to give you some quotes from him from a speech he gave just before his inauguration to show what he actually thought about in the question of leadership. What should the leadership of the United States represent? Who should be a statesman? What does a leader have to do? And he said, this famous statement for of those to whom much is given, much is required. And when at some future date the high court of history sits in judgment on each one of us, our success or failure in whatever office we hold will be measured by the answers to 4 questions. 1, were we truly men of courage? with the courage to stand up to one's enemies and the courage to stand up when necessary to one's associates, the courage to resist public pressure as well as private greed. Very important statement there. Secondly, were we truly men of judgment, with perceptive judgment of the future as well as the past, of our own mistakes as well as the mistakes of others, with enough wisdom to know what we did not know and enough candor to admit it. Third, were we truly men of integrity, men who never ran out on either the principles in which we believed or the people who believed in us, men whom neither financial gain nor political ambition could ever divert from the fulfillment of our sacred trust. And finally, were we truly men of dedication, with an honor mortgaged to no single individual or group and compromised by no private obligation or aim, but devoted solely to serving the public good and the national interest. When I read those words the other day, thinking about this presentation, I think those words of Kennedy reflect the thinking of people like your father, from what I could get from reading your report. That your father, my father, people from that generation, and by the way, that was a generation of Lyndon LaRouche as well, believed in the principles of the nation, believed that this was a country dedicated to principles of general welfare above private interest, private greed. This is what Franklin Roosevelt meant when he founded the United Nations, saying we're going to pursue the common interests of mankind, that he intended the UN to be an agency of breaking the ties of colonialism and offering not just to rebuild our defeated enemies, Germany and Japan, but the countries that were under the chains of European colonialism. Kennedy was moving in that direction, unmistakably, when he was taken from us in November 1963. It wasn't just about Vietnam. It was about the economy, moving away from the Federal Reserve to a national banking policy, the same kind of national banking policy that Franklin Roosevelt initiated to break the power of the Morgans and the Mellons and the Citibank and the Rockefellers. The same system that gave us Glass-Steagall. Kennedy was moving to take financial power away from the oligarchy and return it to the people of the nation through the Congress. Now, when you look at what happened after Kennedy's assassination, this is where the tragedy takes place. Was his death tragic? Yes, of course it was. Anytime someone is taken prematurely, whether it was Tom OLoughlin, John Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, or the common person who dies because they can't get medical care, or because of some accident, or in war. There's a personal tragedy there. But the bigger tragedy is, what was their life for? The fact that people were fighting for a better idea of how a republic can serve the nation, which I think Tom OLoughlin was doing, which I know John Kennedy was doing, as opposed to those people like the Dulles brothers, who were instruments of personal greed and private fortune. And what happened after Kennedy? We went in a different direction. We had the rock, sex, drug counterculture, which really perverted a whole segment of our youth, including people like myself. We put personal pleasure and personal gain ahead of service to the nation and community. We started looking for what's in it for me. How can I profit from this? What experiences can I have that bring me pleasure and help me avoid pain? The Benthamite calculus, which was against the idea that Ben Franklin put into the Constitution of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. For Franklin, pursuit of happiness was not about sexual pleasure and drug experience. It was about knowing that you lived a life that made the world better for your family and the future. That's the happiness, the Leibnizian happiness, the best of all possible worlds, that people like Tom OLoughlin took as their mission when he was looking into who were the enemies of this country. And as John points out, what was he looking at? the very networks that were bringing drugs into the country, that were laundering the drug money, that were involved in keeping us in Vietnam as part of a drug operation. This is the crowd that came to power in the last 30 years. This is why you see a bipartisan consensus for war. Why are we conducting these never-ending wars? Why, when President Trump tried to pull us out of it, did leadership in both parties say, no, we have to fight these wars? Why are we going with free trade agreements, which strip our industrial power away and send our jobs to other countries? Why do we create a hellhole in the cities and then allow drugs to proliferate and drug money laundering banks to get away with a small fine? I think these are the things that someone like Tom OLoughlin was looking at as coming up in the future and as problems that had to be addressed if we were to fulfill our destiny as a nation and to make the sacrifice of the millions of people who sacrificed during World War II, make their sacrifice worthwhile. One of the things I learned from LaRouche when I first came around him is this idea that we're all mortal and that we have to have something higher in our intent than our own pleasure. And he used the cartoon from the New Yorker magazine of a man sitting up at his funeral in his coffin, looking around at all the people mourning and asking the question, I wonder what that was all about. What was my life all about? I think many of the World War II veterans knew what their life was all about. I think, unfortunately, many of them, when they passed on, were somewhat mournful of the fact that the joy that they had in building a nation and a better world was being lost by the subsequent generations seeking personal gain and personal pleasure above national mission. So I think in that sense, when you look across an individual's life, someone like Tom, who had a mission, who accepted a mission, maybe at times he wasn't so happy about it because it did involve sacrifice, as John makes clear in his memoir. Nevertheless, this is what was taken up as the purpose of one's life. And as we look at the crises we face today, we have to ask ourselves, where are the statesmen today? Where are the people like John Kennedy, like Eisenhower, who was a lesser figure than Kennedy on this, certainly lesser than Roosevelt, but nevertheless had a sense that he had a duty to live up to the responsibility to make the lives that were lost a meaningful contribution to the future. We don't have that. We had an element of that in Reagan, but it was pretty much stripped away by the assassination attempt against him and the George H.W. Bush control over his presidency. Whatever was intended by Bill Clinton, he went off the rails. In fact, he signed the bill to repeal Glass-Steagall, which Roosevelt implemented to save us from rapacious, greedy corporate bankers. You look at the presidencies of Bush Jr. going into a war based on lies, knowing that they were lying. You look at Obama, who spoke like a progressive while he was governing like an oligarch and carrying out policies, including regime change wars, sanction policies. Go back to Bill Clinton, for example. The sanctions against Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the 90s killed 500,000 children. And when asked about this, Madeleine Albright said it was a tough decision, but it was worth it. In other words, to bring down Saddam was worth 500,000 young lives. The same thing that Tony Blinken says today about the Caesar sanctions in Syria, when he says that when he looks into the eyes of his two daughters, he sees the suffering of the children in Syria. But he's contributing to that suffering by the Caesar sanctions, which prevent food and medicine and parts and equipment from going into Syria, and has plunged 90% of the population in Syria below the poverty line. This is not the kind of statecraft that our great heroes in World War II risked their lives for to see today being done in the name of the United States. So I think we can take this commemoration of Thomas OLoughlin to reflect back on this tragedy which we continue to live through. Will we be silent in the case of these kinds of extraordinary evils that are being perpetrated in our name? Whether it's sanctions on countries like Syria and Yemen, the continuation of wars throughout much of the world, the priority to personal greed as opposed to providing health care for all, providing education for all, infrastructure that serves everyone, as opposed to space trips that tickle the fantasy of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. We've got to come back to the idea that we're a nation with a mission that represents the common interests of the whole nation. And that beyond that, that we have a mission to the world to bring that tradition to them. And so I thank you, John, for this opportunity to reflect on this shift in paradigm that I consider the present tragedy we're living through. But by being able to reflect on it, maybe we can bring to those people who are living through it today a sense of the higher duty that we have, the mission to our country, the mission to our fellow citizens, the mission to the whole world to do good for mankind. So thank you.
Harley Schlanger, thank you so very, very much for this great gift you've given us this morning here in Mystery Island, Maryland, and Potsdam, Germany in the afternoon, and around the world where people are listening and participating in the chat room. I'm thinking of Hamlet and a play I never understood. I could not grasp it in high school when we had to read it. I tried again in college, and I just never could see it. And the reason that I couldn't see it is because it really is my own story.
I think that's what a lot of people think when they look at it. You know, the so-called personal tragedy. Why didn't I act more effectively when I had a chance? Well, that is part of the tragedy. But what was the society under? The society was under beliefs that you see it in the famous scene where they're having a big party. It's a month after his father was murdered. They're having a big party and everyone's getting drunk. And Hamlet looks at this and he's insulted by it, but he doesn't know what to do. And I think if you reread it again, John, and think about it from that standpoint, that Shakespeare, what was Shakespeare, the context for this? Queen Elizabeth had just died, not much, I think 2 years earlier. The question was who would replace her? What would be the ordinary circumstance for the country? She had no heir. And instead they brought in the Stuarts, the Scottish oligarchy with ties to the French. Was that good for the people of England? I would argue it wasn't, especially if you know, Shakespeare couldn't be so blunt as to come out and say he didn't trust the Stuarts. But essentially, that's what the play is about. What do you do when the ordinary succession doesn't work? And do you speak the truths that are necessary? And Hamlet, because of the conditions of the court, even his friends, they didn't have the courage to challenge the axioms of the whole society. They knew it was rotten. You know, he says there was something rotten in Denmark, but they didn't know how to deal with that. And I don't think Shakespeare is trying to get you to think about what would the solution be, but do you live in a similar circumstance? And I think your story about your father and what must have been the bittersweet part of his life, knowing that he was engaging in necessary defense of the nation. But why should he have to defend the nation from some of the nation's elites? You know, don't you have a sense of betrayal over that? And I'm sure that that was something that he took to heart.
Well, you're exactly right. He certainly did take it to heart. I'm sorry, I've been adjusting my audio. Somebody said there was a little buzz, and I'm trying to fix it there. So my feeling of support that I get from people, especially you know, experts in history like yourself and Shakespeare, But all the guests that have been with me over the past couple of years, and all of the great folks that come to the charrettes and that participate in the chat room, I want to say this to you. You make the difference between me and a Hamlet, because Hamlet couldn't handle it, and he ended up taking his own life. And if I had kept all this stuffed inside myself and not shared it with you folks, then I might have been in danger of something like that. But now I've got this great community all around the world of people that are aware of who my father is, was, and continues to be. As we say, our theme here is the McDuff Lives. That means that McDuff is a spirit. He's not just my dad. McDuff is the person that comes and straightens out after all of the disasters that Harley has been describing here that have befallen our country. And just to characterize my dad as the one with the good sword, the carrying on the fight against the internal enemies, which if you think about it, that's exactly what he chose to do after World War II, because at the end of the war he had to make a decision. He'd been offered a commission in the regular Navy, and that was something he really wanted to do. I think he found himself happy in the Navy, as you see in this picture of him on the front of Andy's great publication here that he's making for us. McDuff Lives: The Life and Untimely Death of Thomas F. O'Loughlin Jr. And we'll be making that available very shortly. But my point is that he had to decide to go home for family reasons, to support the family. And it was a time when family meant everything. Mm-hmm. And so he did go home and do his duty there. But when he got a chance to enter into his own professional life, he chose to protect the country against the domestic enemies. And so he had covered the foreign enemies, and now he's going to the domestic enemies, and that's why he joins the FBI, because he is aware of the threat within, and supported Director Hoover's efforts to contain and eradicate all of the threats, whether it was communism, Nazism, or any other ism that was threatening the constitutional government of this country.
John, if I may make a comment on that, I think that one of the problems is that I would put Hoover eventually as one of those domestic problems, because what he did with the FBI at a certain point, instead of defending the nation, was he attacked some of the people, including the Kennedys, including Martin Luther King. But I want to go back to another point that I think is very important, which is that it's often said that most of the World War II veterans were reluctant to talk about what they did during the war, and they didn't see themselves as heroes. And I know my father didn't talk about what he did until he was nearing his own death. And what I found out from him was that he was in the Signal Corps. That was because he spoke French and had a background in radio. He was deployed to the front lines when the Allies went into Paris. He was with the first group of Americans that went into Paris, was up on the Eiffel Tower. He marched in with de Gaulle in August 1944. Now, I would have loved to have known that as a history buff, as a child. And I asked him, why didn't you ever tell me about that? And he said, that was just what we did. We didn't see it as heroic. And this idea of the reason I took those quotes from Kennedy, this idea that if you have the blessings of liberty, of growing up in the United States, you have responsibilities to make sure that's passed on. And I think that's the way the previous generation, our parents' generation, saw it. And our generation basically said, they were losers, they were suckers, some of them died. I stayed out of the war, I made my money. You know, it's a different mentality. And I'm not saying everybody's that way, but there's an element of that. When people say, yeah, there are bad guys out there, but they're too powerful, you can't do anything about it. That's shucking responsibility. And if too many people do that, the people who are committed to personal greed and personal comfort over a national purpose have no contest. They win. And so, it's very important to reflect on that, especially those of us who are now, getting older and looking back on our parents' generation, and realize that there was something heroic about seeing that as being a normal citizen. And in the case of your father, he went beyond what would have been normally expected. He dedicated his life to it. But I think that's what we should all take to heart as what our mission as Americans should be.
I want to delve into that for another moment, if you don't mind, Harley, because that
Sure.
really touches me pretty deeply. I think we speak here at our channel, which began with the name of McDuff, Kennedy's man to smash the CIA, by the way. And that was the channel's name for the first 2 years until it got terminated by the YouTube gods. But
By the CIA.
well, we made it for 2 years carrying that flag, and so now we carry on here at McDuff Lives. But we have this concept called a McDuff moment, and it's the moment in which you have to make that choice of I'm in or I'm out. And once you make that choice that you're in, then you really can't get out. And that is what happens to people. I think of it maybe in terms of maybe if you're in the military service and you're an officer and you come out of college and you go to be an ensign and a lieutenant and a captain. Well, there's a certain point, maybe somewhere between commander and captain or major and colonel, where you're either in or you're out. And because you get to a point where this NATO stuff and all of the reality behind the scenes is going to be apparent to you. And you're going to see stuff happen, and you're going to be asked to look the other way, and things are going to be say, hey, this is just between us. And or in other ways, my father, of course, was if you when you read my book, you'll see what I'm saying about him having a McDuff moment when a couple of guys took him for a little walk and said, here's a couple of books to look at. This is about what's going on, and we're doing something about it. We want to tell you about it. We want you to help us out with it. And he had to say, no, I'm not going to do it. That was it. And that may very well have sealed his fate, because they told him about it thinking he'd be in, but he says, no, I'm out. Well, what do you do now? Because now he knows about it. And for the next few years of his life, I think he was kind of under that type of a situation. Well,
that's
what I think we all have to face at some point. And that's my point, is that this is an iconic case of somebody that had to do that on a big scale, but we all have to do it. And the thing that people don't understand is once you're in, you're in. And it's very, very difficult to change your mind. Thanks for listening to my little rant on what you said, but that did touch me pretty deeply, yeah.
But that's an important point. Friedrich Schiller talks about this idea of a punctum saliens, a moment within an unfolding of a story where you have to make a choice. And he talked about the big event in his lifetime, which was the French Revolution. He said a great moment found a little people, that people vented their rage against the oligarchy, but did not create a constitutional republic. And you had leaders like Lafayette and others who were sort of shunted aside. Now, for me, I was in the anti-war movement as a student at the University of Wisconsin, where almost everyone was in the anti-war movement. Our idea of fighting against the conformity of society is we all grew our hair long, grew beards, and put on bell bottoms and tie-dye. And we never thought for a moment, we're conforming. How is this going your own way? And I ran into LaRouche shortly after that when I was in graduate school. And LaRouche said, well, what do you do? And I said, I'm a graduate student. And I said, how do I know what you're saying is right? And he said, well, if you're a graduate student, you know how to use a library, go figure it out. Figure it out for yourself. But he then said something else that really struck me. He just said, look, you're going to probably live another 50, 60 years. If you are out to end this war, what takes place after you stop the Vietnam War? What's the ultimate goal? Do you know why we're in this war? And I, of course, had all the talking points of the left at the time, but I didn't know. And I took the time to go doing some study. And I learned something that LaRouche had forecast before August 15th, 1971, when Nixon took the dollar off gold and ended the Bretton Woods system. LaRouche had forecast this was about to happen. And I wanted to know, how did he know that? And I devoted my life to working with him. I was a spokesman for 20 years from beginning in 1999. And I see every day the ideas that we discussed at the center of policy fights. And it's not that you're not afraid of going off on your own, because if you do go off on your own, if you do break with the axioms, you get attacked. LaRouche was called an anti-Semite, which is a complete lie, a Nazi, a communist, a brainwasher, a cult leader, all sorts of things. And what he said is that just shows how much they fear me. And I think the important thing is that you have to embrace the fear. I think about, I never was in combat. And when I was reading your memoir, I realized your father was there when a ship got hit, when people were dying. And he had to make split-second decisions, the same way Kennedy did with the PT boat that he was in. These are moments where you are conscious of taking actions that you would go against personal survival. I guess that's what I'm trying to say, that you have to look at this question of what is the ultimate meaning of my life. And this is something that people are largely afraid to do. But once they do, it gives them the courage to be able to proceed, as you're saying, to continue with that fight. And I think, I applaud you for what you're doing with your program, because you're bringing a reality to people that is not available to them from the ordinary sources of information. And hopefully people are inspired to do some of their own investigation, challenge their own beliefs, and hopefully step forward and become leaders in a fight for a just America.
Well, I'm certainly inspired and most grateful to Harley Schlanger for being with us here to celebrate my dad's 50th anniversary of his passing on June the 6th, D-Day, of course, and an anniversary of the deaths of many great heroes. As I say, my dad is somebody that I didn't know very well during his life, but I'm getting to know him much better with all of your help, and certainly support the work of the folks at LaRouche Organization. Harley Schlanger does a fantastic job. He has a video blog every morning, weekday mornings anyway, and very much worth tuning in to see what he has to say every morning here on the East Coast. Harley, thanks very much. Anything else you'd like to add, and any references to any of your productions that you'd like to make?
Oh, no, just thank you for the work that you do. We're going to have a conference June 26th and 27th. You can find out more about it by going to theschillerinstitute.com. And we're going to take up the question that's precisely this question: the mission of America as opposed to the rules that benefit the few. This idea of the rules-based order is something that just angers me quite a bit, because the rules are arbitrary. So how do you revisit this question of doing what's necessary for mankind, as opposed to sticking to the rules that are imposed by people who have power? So if people want to join us, it's free. It's an online conference, 2 days, the 26th and 27th of June. I just signed up someone as a speaker who's a very influential person. I can't really divulge much more now, but we've had people from Russia, from China, from Syria, from Italy, from France, international gathering to discuss these questions. So please join us then.
Okay, thanks everybody. Let's have a meaningful rest of the day.